Okay, we're on the Torah portion Vayigash, and last night I really went through a more self-contained lesson with the Monday night class, and with you guys I'd like to just bring some things to a close from last week and from Hanukkah, because I think part of my problem today is going to be the seven shepherds and the eighth prince teaching is still in my head from the weekend. So I hope it doesn't sound too disconnected for you. And I was going to say, if you haven't heard teaching before, just go to HRN's Facebook page and watch the videos, the 2 sessions at the conference, but they've already taken those down. Don't really, either digitize them or package them as DVDs or something. Later, but those are already down, so I can't tell you to go watch those. But there is, what did I just record? Yeah, there should be several programs on HRN that are just, if you go into their website and do a little bit of searching, I think you'll be able to find some programs in there. But after this studying for last weekend, I realized I probably need to do a part 2 of Seven Shepherds and focus on the battles of the eighth prince, which I think we can decipher in a basic way. Of course, we can't predict anything, but I think we can find the patterns just like we always do. If we look at some of David's battles, particularly with the Edomites, because that's part of the Hanukkah liturgy, is that the seven shepherds and the eight princes will defeat the red one, which is Edom. And in the Haftorah for this week, which is in Ezekiel 37, if you back up a few chapters into Ezekiel 34, you'll realize it's a very long treatise on the shepherds of Israel. And these have been the bad shepherds. And it points out in very specific ways what they're doing wrong, and then it speaks of the prince. In fact, somebody emailed me a day or two ago and said, who's the prince in Ezekiel? Well, common rabbinic is the prince who eats in the temple and so forth, and seems to be working very closely with the priesthood, is expected to be the Messiah. We would call him the eighth prince or the seventh shepherd. Actually, he'd be more like, the main shepherd. If we look at it in terms of a chiasm, being more in that middle role of the seven shepherds. At any rate, so I just wanted to try to bring some things to a conclusion, and then maybe just open up some fresh things for you to search out. They might pique your interest. They're just strange parallels. And if I found a few, then you might be able to track down a few with Elisha and the story of Yosef. And then again, we know from last week, we kind of have the geography of Yosef's journey into exile. Basically, he goes north, and then the caravan's going to take him south into Egypt. But there was a misunderstanding about where his brothers were pasturing the flock. He thought they were in Shechem, and as it turns out, they're in Dothan, which is not that far away. But Samaria, or Shomron, is going to factor into this as well, because they're like a little triangle. They're clustered right there together. We're talking about the same area. And we know that Elisha is from this area. Dothan is the city that he's in when they see the chariots of fire surrounding the city. And this area of Samaria, or Shomron, is where once the monarchy splits, and then you have Judah in the south and you have Israel, or the house of Joseph in the north, this is going to be where the Ephraimite kings established their capital in Samaria, in Shomron. As an alternate, they built an alternate altar in Bethel, not far away. You can still go to that there, but just flat rock. But you can see where they would have built something there at Beit El. And then you can also go up into Tel Dan, where they built the other alternate altar. So they built one on their southern boundary and then one up north to make it much easier for people to come bring their sacrifices. It wasn't exactly a live stream, but much more convenient. So we've got this area here that is significant in terms of not just spiritual location, but in terms of the divided monarchy. Okay, so we're going to skip down through here. And the question last night, which was really interesting because somebody asked the question last week, why didn't Yosef notify his father that he was okay once he came out of prison? And so I researched that question. And I finally found some commentary from Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. And I thought it was a wonderful way of looking at it, because it's a role of investigator, and to put yourself into Yosef's sandals and to consider only the evidence he would have known. And because, we're kind of omniscient as a reader, we're reading everybody's thoughts and reading their dialogue. We forget that Yosef didn't have that benefit. And so what he could have construed in his mind was much different than the reality. And we all do that. In the absence of facts, we fill it in with what we think other people are thinking or doing. And that may have explained why he never restored back. And it's not until Genesis 41 when Judah finally tells him what his dad's response was when he knew that Yosef was missing, that he thought he was torn in pieces. It's only at that point that Yosef realizes it wasn't all a big plot. And that's the point, Genesis 45:1, it says, then Yosef could not control himself. Up to that point, he would get a little weepy and he would walk out, he'd get himself together and he would come back. But this is the point where he cannot carry out the show any longer, because that real question about his father has been answered. His father does not know what actually happened. His father did not know what actually happened. And this is why his father never came to rescue him, because Yaakov had the means to come find out where his son was and rescue him to buy him back out of slavery. He never did. So at this point, this is when he can't control himself. And he asks his brothers, he says, I am Yosef. Is my father still alive? And at this point, his brothers are speechless because they don't know what to think. It says at his presence. Now, he already knows his father is alive. So this is a deeper question. Again, there's more than one way to be alive. And that's maybe, the question that Yosef has been asking himself for the last 22 years. Did my father really love me? Or was that special coat just a deception to get me to go to the pit where he had my brothers waiting on me? And it all traces back to the dream and Yaakov rebuking him for the dream. And so that, according to Rabbi Sachs, would have been the question in the back of Joseph's mind for this entire period, because he didn't know anything to the contrary. He didn't know of any other way to construe it. Once we worked through all the evidence last night, the conclusion is reasonable that possibly his father was in on the deception and wanted him to go down into the pit. And he felt by his father. When his father doesn't come and seek him out, then he concludes, well, that must have been the case. I made him so angry with that dream that he's just forsaken me. The way that he basically turned his back on Reuven and Shimon and Levi. And we can see this echoed when Yeshua is on the cross. He feels like the Father has abandoned him. Even though it says in the Psalms, you will not abandon my soul to Sheol. It's hard to remember that when you're at your worst, when you're in such darkness, which Yeshua must have been experiencing. He shouts, he cries in a loud voice. He says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Even Yeshua felt abandoned at that point in the deepest of darkness. And he was experiencing this same situation. He had been over to foreigners who had taken his garments. They had divided the spoils. And at that point he asked, my Father really loved me? Or did he just deceive me into sacrificing my life and going down into the pit? Just imagine knowing the Torah like Yeshua would have, and how many of these events would have been going through his head at exactly the same time. Because how many of you have ever thought you understood prophecy, but yet when bad things started happening, you second-guessed yourself and said, maybe that's not the interpretation of that. Maybe I have it backward. Because in those moments, that's truly the test. I don't know whether I'm doing the right thing or not. Have I just completely misunderstood the whole point of this particular verse of scripture? And I don't, as a human being, that human part of Yeshua, that had to have been going through the human mind. Has my Father abandoned? Does he really love me? Is he going to let me descend to the pit and not rescue me? So I think what Yosef is asking when he says, does my father still live? He knows he's alive, physically alive. But see, if that relationship is as close as Yosef felt it was, if his father really loved him that much, then how can his father live as long as Yosef is missing? So that's the question that really doesn't get an answer. It's at that deeper spiritual level. But this is what he wants to know. Does my father still love me? Because if he still lives, then he still loves me. If he lives at that level, at that spiritual level, what he's basically saying is, did my father really reject me? Or if he lives, no, that's not what happened. Instead, I can say my father still loves me with that deep love that I thought he did when he gave me the coat. And so we can kind of see a repetition here. We know that Yaakov had to take on Esau's name when he said, I am Esau. He had to become a man of the field. He had to become a shepherd. He had to become a keeper of flocks, a man of the field. And in this situation, we don't hear Yosef say, I am Benjamin. He says, I am Yosef. But he may as well have said, I am Ben-Oni, which remember was Benjamin's initial name. Rachel gave him son of my suffering. And Yaakov says, no, not him. He's not going to be the son of my suffering. He's going to be the son of my right hand. As it turned out, Yosef was the son of suffering. But it opens the way there again for Benjamin. His tribal territory is going to fall there at the Temple Mount. So he will have that blessing through the ages for his territory to be there at the Father's house, for the Father's house to be built in his territory. So just to recap last week, we know that Yosef keeps wanting to hear them say that they're looking for him. They're seeking their lost brother. They never seek him out. They're always a little suspicious of him. They never trust him, which is a terrible position to be in. But their perception of his role never really developed beyond power and position. And so we know that in Joshua, it tells about the burial of Yosef in Shechem, which is where his story really started in terms of exile. And he joins his mother, Rachel, and then he basically joins his father, Yaakov, two people who could not be comforted because of those who were not. And we see Yosef still mourning that his brothers did not seek him out. He was never brought up. As many situations as he created for them to seek him out, they did not. But one day they will, and they will mourn for him as for an only son. So let's go into remember, we have two dreams we're working with. We have the economic dream based on earth of prosperity, symbolized by the sheaves. And then we have this governing dream of the sun, the moon, and the stars, which is a heavenly dream. It's more of a spiritual dream, but his father's dream of the latter connects the two, heaven and earth. And this is what we see in Yosef. He's going to unite two kinds of authority. The authority which is divine, which is from above, and the authority on earth. We're going to see all sorts of symbols and pictures of the Messiah in him. Now, eventually, we also know that we're seeing the patriarchs in transition at this point, because at this point, a firstborn son would still function as the priest of the family. But this is going to transform when the Israelites come out of Egypt, and the tribe of Levi is going to take on, one of their clans is going to take on that priestly role. And of course, the Levites are going to take on the service of the tabernacle. And it's going to be clearer that Yehuda, as the fourth in birth order, 4 being the number of authority, especially divine authority, he will actually take preeminence over Reuven, Shimon, and Levi as it pertains to the throne. So the brothers do bow down to Yosef, but it didn't mean they ever really accepted him as their leader. That garment fell to Yehuda. The priesthood garment fell to Levi. And we see it in their history, they do stick together. They do see it as complementary roles rather than adversarial roles, even though our longest history is of adversarial roles between brothers. We see that Caleb and Yehoshua stick together. When the 12 spies come back, they stick together. They get a good report. And at least as it pertains to Yehoshua, excuse me, there's a background there. Yehoshua, coming from the house of Joseph, the tribe of Ephraim, Joseph was known as, the one who brings reports. And Yehoshua overturns this. So I don't think it's any coincidence that Yosef accuses the 10 brothers of being spies. And they're like, no, that's not what we're doing. Thanks. And so when Yehoshua brings back a good report on behalf of the house of Yosef, then that's kind of a rectification of a problem of their ancestor Yosef. But in Yosef, you see unified roles. You'll see that he has some connection to the priesthood because he marries an Egyptian who is the daughter of an Egyptian priest. And then we see him second in command to Paro, which again would be a royal role. And that's what we get from the Haftorah portion from Ezekiel 30, because it's the prophecy of the 2 sticks. And it's interesting in this Art Scroll version, those 2 sticks are called 2 wooden tablets. And it points out, I think, that there are 4 words on one tablet. one wooden tablet, and I think it's 7 on the other wooden tablet, where Ezekiel is having to write on the one and the other. So that's something I might try to chase down at some point. Like, I wonder why they're seeing it more as a wooden tablet than 2 sticks, like the traditional interpretation. But the Haftorah is speaking of a time when the 2 kingdoms would be one. They would be united under the prince, David, who has an identity of a shepherd. And so royalty will carry with it the obligations of a shepherd. And that's what we're seeing. If you flip back to Ezekiel 34, you'll see that it is the monarchs. If it's not quite clear to you, if you study it and pay close attention, not just to that chapter, but to the entire context of the chapter, you'll see that it is the monarchs or the princes being singled out as evil shepherds. So the rectification of that is going to be the prince who is called David, who will be a son of David, who will again unite the monarchy. I just ate chili, which I don't know why I did that. It had too much spice. So let's go back to this prophecy in Amos. Remember, Amos is the shepherd of Tekoa. And in Amos 5:6-8, he says, "Seek the Lord that you may live, or he will come forth like a fire, O house of Yosef." So this prophecy is specifically to the house of Yosef. And it will consume with none to quench it. For Beit El, and now we have context for Beit El, we have Jacob's ladder. We have the place. He says, "For those who turn justice into wormwood and cast righteousness down to the earth." Again, rulership, which is ordained in the heavenlies. Remember Yosef's dream of the sun, the moon, and the stars. It says where righteousness should be found in the royalty, in the rulers, in the princes, it says they've cast it down to earth. He says, "He who makes the Pleiades and Orion and changes deep darkness into morning." So he's pointing out specifically to the house of Yosef, trying to cause them to remember Yosef's dream of rulership. But he's saying, house of Yosef, you have been evil, and I don't want you to go to Beit El. Beit El is going to be a trap for you if you go there. Amos 5:18, "You who are longing for the day of the Lord, for what purpose will the day of the Lord be to you?" And if you've ever run into somebody who does nothing but, scroll through conspiracy theories, looking for the day of darkness and gloom, maybe this question is for them. It says, "It will be darkness and not light, as when a man flees from a lion and a bear meets him, or goes home, leans his hand against the wall, and a snake bites him. Will not the day of the Lord be darkness instead of light, even gloom with no brightness in it? I reject your festivals, nor do I delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer up to me offering your grain offerings, I will not accept them. And I will not even look at the peace offerings of your fatlings." And there, when you're looking at those grain offerings, that's directly related to the mincha. Remember the presents that we read about last week, the presents that Yaakov sent to Esau, the presents that Yaakov sends to Yosef before he knows he's Yosef. These presents, a mincha, and it's also a grain offering that you would bring into the tabernacle or the temple. So he's speaking here of exiles, different kinds of exiles. The lion is an exile in Babylon. There's a bear that represents Media and Persia, and that's actually 2 kingdoms. So there's going to be 2 bears, and I'll show you that where that occurs with Elisha. And then there's an exile actually in the land when Greece occupies Judah, where it says he goes home, leans his hand against the wall, and a snake bites him. So, the Jews thought they were home free. We're back in the land. We rebuilt our temple. And what happens? The Greeks show up. So even in your own house, after you're home, the snake can come and bite you. And then in the time of Yeshua, Greece would have been replaced by Rome. They still are in exile inside their land, being oppressed inside their land, but there will be another transition, and then Rome will send them once again into exile. And that's one thing to remember is if it wasn't for the Greeks, we wouldn't have probably the Hanukkah we know today. All the biblical and all of our biblical and rabbinic holidays commemorate events that took place outside the land of Israel. But Hanukkah and Purim, Hanukkah, not Purim, Hanukkah is an exile, but a celebration from that exile inside the land. Right? It's a Sukkot Sheni, so it is related to something that originated outside the land when they went into Sukkot after they came out of Egypt. But yet Chanukah Sheni, which is, Sukkot Sheni, which is what Chanukah is actually grounded inside the land itself. And so you have two types of enemies. You have the enemy from outside, and then you also have to worry about the enemy on the inside. So where's this? 2 Kings 2:15. I want to show you the two bears, not the three bears. This when the sons of the who were at Jericho opposite him saw him, they said, and this is after Egypt has been taken up by the whirlwind into the chariot. When they saw Elisha, who remember caught the mantle, they said, the spirit of Eliyahu rests on Elisha. And they came to meet him and bowed themselves to the ground before him. They said to him, behold now, there are with your servants 50 strong men. Please let them go and search for your master. Perhaps, and this is significant, I didn't really notice it up until yesterday, when we've talked about place bending between, say, Beit El and Mount Moriah, how sometimes you can be in one place and then all of a sudden you're in another place. These prophets of Jericho don't seem to have any trouble with that whatsoever, because they say perhaps the Spirit of the Lord has taken him up and cast him on some mountain or into some valley. See, they're wanting to go look for him like he's not really gone. He's around here somewhere. It's just that the Spirit of the Lord will snatch you up and toss you, into different locations. And he said, you shall not sin, because Elisha had seen him go up. He knew where he went. But when they urged him until he was ashamed, he said, send. They sent therefore 50 men, and they searched 3 days, but did not find him. And again, there's this expectation that if he were dead, his soul would have actually, completely separated from his body at that point. There was no point in searching. They returned to him while he was staying at Jericho, and he said to them, didn't I tell you not to go? Then the men of the city said to Elisha, behold, now it is pleasant as my Lord sees, but the water is bad, and the land is unfruitful. And if you remember, there was a curse on Jericho. It wouldn't be inhabited again. And people say, well, why did they move back in? And this is the reason why. They tend to repopulate Jericho because Elisha cleansed it. He basically removed the curse from it. He said, bring me a new jar and put salt in it. So they brought it to him. He went out to the spring of water and threw salt in it and said, thus says the Lord, I have purified these waters. There shall not be from their death or unfruitfulness any longer. So the waters have been purified to this day, according to the word of Elisha, which he spoke. Then he went up from there to Beit El. This is kind of important. And as he was going up by the way, young lads came out from the city and mocked him and said to him, "Go up, you bald head. Go up, you bald head." When he looked behind him and saw them, he cursed them in the name of the Lord. Then 2 female bears came out of the woods and tore up the 42 lads of their number. He went from Carmel, and from there he returned to Samaria. Right, so when we talk of these 2 kingdoms of Media and Persia, we can see right here, even though it says 1 bear, they're actually a successive kingdoms. And here, in the case of Elisha, 2 bears come out of the woods. Now, this doesn't seem that incredible, but the rabbinic commentary and the geography tell us there weren't any bears and there wasn't any forest there. It wasn't a place where you would expect to find a forest or bears. It was not usual for where that occurred there at Beit El, because it says they came out from Beit El. Well, you can go to Beit El and look for a forest as long as you want to. There's not going to be one. And it's going to be pretty hard for bears to be in that part of the country. It's just, it's not wild enough for there to be bears. Nevertheless, these wild animals came in and tore. So if we look at the symbolism of prophecy, we know we've got this kingdom, or 2 kingdoms of Media and Persia, who are going to invade and take, the Israelites as exiles. And a forest represents people, because a forest is made of trees. And what does a bear do? But he reigns over his kingdom of the forest. So these boys are mocking Elisha, basically saying, hey, if you're that holy, you go up like Elijah did. Let's see you do that. And we already know that Elisha has asked for a double portion. Their mockery is telling him, well, you don't have the same spiritual status. Yahoo. Let's see you do what he did. Of course, they didn't have long before the bears ate them. But again, on 2 Kings 2:3, we see it was the sons of the prophets at Beit El who came out to Elisha and said, you know, master from over you today. And he said, yes, I know. Be still. So there's this warning coming from the prophets at Beit El to Elisha. It's interesting that you had sons of the prophets operating out of Beit El, and yet you had 42 young men who thought it was cool to mock the prophet. That's really strange. And I don't know why, right? That might be something you could chase down or have ideas about. But it reminds us of Amos' prophecy to the house of Yosef. Don't go up to Beit El on the day of darkness, because the bear is going to come out of Media, Persia. Now, these same 3 beasts in the prophecy interpretations, one says Lavan was the lion, Esau the bear, and Shechem the serpent who struck it home. At any rate, when Yosef is sent on this journey, Yaakov believes his sons are at Shechem, patch in that field that he purchased there. It's, there's a well there known as Yaakov's well, and it's not far from biblical Shechem. And of course, Genesis 33:18 tells us about when he purchased that field, he had actually erected an altar there. But last night we talked about that history of violence at Shechem and how odd it was that Yaakov would send a 17-year-old alone back to that particular place with so much history and so much ill will toward the sons of Israel over the incident with Shechem and Dinah. Instead of being at Shechem, which was Yaakov's property, we find them at Dotan. They're in the wrong place. Dotan means well. And it's north of Shechem. I'll show it to you on a map. And it's going to be about 100 kilometers north of Hebron. And again, that's a long way, 17-year-old kid looking for brothers who hate him through territory where people hate his family. And so how does Samaria or Shomron factor into it? It's only about 12 miles north. And so that's how you can see it. It's really a small place. If you're pasturing sheep, you're going to cover several miles in a day, taking them to both water and to grazing. But Shomron, Samaria, it was the capital of the northern tribes of Israel, the house of Joseph, basically. And that's where the Ephraimite monarchs reigned. We also know that in this area, Eliyahu and Elisha prophesied. Remember, they're prophesying to kings like Ahab and Jezebel and their sons. Remember, they had a daughter, Atalia, who was, one of the biggest rascals. She actually reigned there for a while. Pretty vicious lady. I mean, real vicious. Right? This history of violence continues even in the monarchy, when it's established at Samaria after the two kingdoms splits. But we're talking about the same general area, and we're talking about actually a continuation, again, of the violence that they experienced at Shechem. So here's your map, and you can see where Yosef would have started there from Hebron. He would have gone north, and notice it took him directly through Beit El. This is the warning. Do not go up to Beit El, O house of Joseph. Do not go up there. It's going to be a day of deep darkness. And even though it's after the fact, Yosef didn't have the benefit of this prophecy before he set out. He would have had to have traveled right through the place where Yaakov saw his dream of the ladder connecting heaven and earth. He would have sensed between his dreams and his father's dream. So he continues north there to Shechem, and that's where he expects to find his brothers. And you can see he's not far. None of these distances are very far. But nevertheless, they look pretty good. They should have been at Shechem. And then you can see how Samaria forms that little triangle. So he's right there in this little cluster of areas that have prophetic significance for his own descendants, for the house of Joseph, for the Ephraimites to establish their alternate kingdom and their alternate altars. And so Beit El there is basically going to be the dividing line between the two monarchies, because that's where Jeroboam is going to set up that alternate altar there at the southern end. And then if I had left the rest of the map on there, as you went north, you would see Tel Dan, where he set up the other altar. But it's at Dotan that apparently he's overshot the field and the well of his brother Yaakov at Shechem. And he's going to be thrown into a pit, sold into slavery. And then the most likely route, of course, is going to go down the coast into Egypt. But I put a little red mark there where Samaria was, where you could see basically the headquarters of the northern tribes. And I kind of expanded that one area, but I wanted you to see the journey that he took and how he had to travel through his father's vision, basically, before he started blundering around, it says, at Shechem. But Dotan, up there, and you can see the yard is going to the east. And we know that Pella was where Eliyahu hid out. So Elisha and Eliyahu both spent a lot of time up here in this area, especially since they were prophesying to the northern tribal kings. But what we do know, we've got a double well at Dothan, and Elisha, who has been serving Eliyahu all this time as a prophet to the 10 northern tribes, or the house of Joseph, Elisha asks Eliyahu for a double portion. And so we see that in 2 Kings 2:9. It says, when they had crossed over, Eliyahu said to Elisha, "That's what I shall do for you before I'm taken from you." And Elisha said, "Please let a double portion of your spirit be upon me." And you can see that when you read that he actually did pretty much 12 miracles of Eliyahu. Eliyahu spent a lot of his time on the run, running from Jezebel. But we see also that Yosef, in Genesis 48:22, as he's receiving his blessings, Yaakov says, "I give you a portion more than your brothers, which I took from the hand of the Amorite with my sword and my bow." So we've got Yosef, whose bones are going to be returned to Shechem, where his brothers should have been, which, remember, is adjacent to Samaria, where their palace would have been for the northern tribes, with this Eliyahu and Elisha that talks about a double portion. We also have a strange story about the Arameans that involves Dothan. It's recorded in 2 Kings 6:8, and it has some of the same components of the story of Yosef. And remember, Elisha called Eliyahu my father. And so when he's chariot and so forth, and sees this process of Eliyahu being translated into the whirlwind, he's like, my father, my father. And the government passes to him with that double portion. And Yaakov basically did this. When he gives Yosef a coat indicating that he intends to give him a double portion, that coat is stripped from him, that double portion is stripped from him. Restored says, I'm giving you not a garment this time, I'm giving you property in the land. Perhaps, again, to make up for all those years that he lost, he is given that double portion so that he will not feel disconnected from the land, that he won't feel so disconnected because his brothers never sought him out, that his father never sought him out when he was in exile. And so he gives up that double portion to make him truly feel as though he does have a home and roots in the land. If you read through that account of the Arameans' attack on Dothan, it's actually kind of funny. I mean, I don't know if it's intended to be funny, but it is funny because the Arameans attack Dothan with their chariots and horses and so forth. And the servant of Elisha thinks, oh no, we're surrounded. And Elisha says, open his eyes so that he can see. And then all of a sudden the servant is allowed to see the chariots of Israel surrounding Dothan. And then he's had to pray for the servant's eyes to be open. Then he turns right around and he prays for the Arameans' eyes to be closed, basically blind. And so once that happens, and this is not like I can't see anything blindness, it's that I'm right in the middle of something that I can't see blindness. Like the men who couldn't find the door to Lot's house, it's the same word. They know where they are. They just can't find what they're looking for. And Elisha goes out and basically says, what are you looking for? And they said, well, we're attacking. This is what we're looking for. He says, oh no, me. And so I'm going to show you the map again. You see where Dothan is, and you see where Samaria, okay, they've surrounded Dothan. Elisha goes out there once they're blinded. He says, oh no, you're in the wrong place. And he leads them straight to Samaria, which is the headquarters of the king. It's where his army is going to have the biggest numbers. It's where defense is going to be the strongest. He leads them from Dothan in that state of blindness all the way to Samaria. And it's only after they're surrounded by the king's soldiers in Samaria that they can see again. And now they are surrounded, just the way they thought they had surrounded Dothan. And at that point, the king of Israel, he says, my father, see, this phrase keeps coming up, my father, should I kill them? Once he has them surrounded in Samaria, because Elisha just led them straight to the slaughter. And he doesn't know really what Elisha intends, so he says, my father, should I kill them? I mean, you've lured them right here into a trap. We've got them captured here. We have them surrounded. And Elisha says, no, feed them. And they did. And that particular band of Arameans didn't ever come back. Now, another king, Ben-Hadad, arose, and he did come back and start harassing the northern tribes again. But that particular one, they fed them and sent them back home. And so this whole thing involves, again, armies and chariots. Yosef says, I'm like a father to Pharaoh. And it says specifically, he drove Pharaoh's second chariot. It even says when he went out to meet his father Jacob, he harnessed that chariot, the horses to that chariot himself. And it's kind of a foreshadowing, because see, when his brothers come in looking for food, looking for grain in Egypt, he has them trapped. They are blinded. He sees something they can't see. He sees that he has the power to take vengeance on them for plotting to kill him, for selling him, especially for some of the things that they had to have known he would have been subjected to as a slave in Egypt, being young and being very handsome. And so instead of slaughtering his brothers that he now has trapped, he feeds them and sends them home. It's these interesting parallels. And remember, from the encyclopedia, one thing we read last week, it says, as the token of authority, Pharaoh handed Yosef his signet ring. This recalls the title royal seal bearer, accorded selected high officials. Right? He's seen as a father to Pharaoh. He's bearing this signet ring. And again, we can see in Yosef this blended role. Royal to the highest end, and he says, this makes me like a father to Pharaoh. And he's also a giver of life through bread. And his Yehuda is a shepherd. And these two types in rabbinic literature are the two types of Messiah. We have Yosef, who is performing a royal service, but yet being this economic provider and protector. And then we have Yosef also being formed, and he is a shepherd, and his offspring are destined to become kings. And so you see these two aspects. You see the royal aspect, and you see the shepherd aspect of Messiah. In Micah 5:5, it says, he will arise and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord and the majesty of the name of the Lord his God, and they will remain, because at that time he will be great to the ends of the earth. This one will be our peace. When the Assyrian invades our land, when he tramples on our citadels, then we will raise against him 7 shepherds and 8 leaders. Some translations will say princes, 8 princes of men. And it's interesting too that as the rabbis take a look at Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they say that Abraham and Isaac experienced limitations in terms of the territory that is known as Israel. But they say in Jacob, they say those for him were bounded. In other words, the kingdom promised to him was much bigger. It extended into the earth, and Abraham's and Isaac's did not. So that's interesting. And then we have Zerubbabel and Yehoshua. After the Babylonian exile is coming to an end, and now the Jews have a choice. They can stay in Babylon, or they can come back and rebuild the temple of Israel. And two were appointed to lead that charge, even though you have prophets like Ezra and Nehemiah and so forth. You have people filling offices. Zerubbabel and Yehoshua were going to be appointed to function as types of shepherds, royalty and priesthood, in order to lead the Jews back from Babylon. And we even see that instruction in the book of Revelation. Come out of her, my people. Once I release you from your exile, don't stay out there. Don't become economically happy in Babylon so that you forget where home is. So under their leadership, the temple was supposed to be rebuilt. Now, if you go to Ezekiel 34, you can see that this entire chapter addresses the shepherds, right? Everything in here is to the shepherds. It says, Ben-Adam, prophesy against Israel's shepherds. Prophesy and say to them, to the shepherds, thus says my Lord, Hashem Elohim, woe, shepherds of Israel who have shepherded themselves. Should it not be the sheep whom the shepherds tend? Should you eat the fat? Should you don the wool? Should you slaughter the choices, but not tend the sheep? The frail you have not strengthened, the ill you have not cured, the broken you have not bound, the banished you have not retrieved, the lost you have not sought, but with force you have subjugated them, and with rigor. Thus they were scattered without a shepherd, and they became food for all the beasts of the field, and they were scattered further. And this is like the story of Yosef. The shepherds of the sheep were those who actually tore him. My sheep wander through all the mountains, and upon every high hill, and upon the whole face of the earth have my sheep scattered, and no one searches or seeks. Therefore, shepherds, listen to the word of Hashem, as I live, the words of my Lord, Hashem Elohim, surely because my sheep become a prey, and my sheep became food for all the beasts of the field without a shepherd. And my shepherds sought not my sheep, and the shepherds tended themselves, but my sheep they did not tend. And it goes on. I mean, it's just woe after woe after woe. But he also talks about the shepherd that's going to retrieve them, where he will make them to lie down in a good fold, and upon fat pastures they will graze. I will tend my sheep, lay them down, seek them out. I will seek out the banished, I will retrieve. The broken I will bind, the frail I will strengthen. And basically I will execute justice upon the shepherds. And it's worth going ahead and reading that whole chapter 34, not just chapter 37, which is the Haftorah portion. That passage in 34 really gives you that context of the king as a great shepherd of his people. But he's saying these kings, these shepherd kings, and even in ancient Egypt, they identified with a ram. And he was a deity of the Nile because he gave life to Egypt. He gave life to the people. That was their belief about the ram. And so, you know, if you see on the pictures, like the Egyptian paintings and so forth, you'll often see like this ram-headed human. But the prince, or this shepherd figure, alludes to the monarchy. And the monarchy has always been there to take on the obligations of a shepherd, not to simply plunder the flock. And so these 7 shepherds and these 8 princes that are prophesied to rise up at Chanukah, basically, they're identified with these roles. So these are going to be royal roles. We say, well, 7 shepherds and 8 princes, that's 2 different things. No, it really isn't, because now you have a background that tells you these 7 shepherds will also take on that royal obligation for the sheep, not just the 8 princes. And what he says in Ezekiel 34, and I wanted to point out the Hebrew word because it's so important. For thus says the Lord God, behold, I myself will search for my sheep. And that word there is darash. I will search. I will darash for my sheep and seek them out. Darash, you might be familiar with that. It's like the 4 levels of study of the Torah. But it's a deep investigative level. It's not a casual method of study. It's deep. That means you investigate thoroughly over every rock. And this is what he says as the great shepherd of the sheep. He says, I'm going to investigate my flock until I recover all those who were broken, who were ill, those who were hungry, those who were drinking from muddy water. He mentions that. And I think a lot of us have drank from muddy water before. But it's the job of these 7 shepherds of Sukkot. Remember, you have Ushpizin. They're also known as the 7 shepherds of Sukkot. And it's their job to come into your sukkah each night of Sukkot for the 7 days, not the 8th day, but for those 7 days. And their job is to do just that, to darash, to deeply investigate those who are dwelling in the sukkah, to see how well they have dwelled in the sukkah. And that's why you always want to take a portion of your sukkah to feed the poor or the needy or a guest a meal, because the rabbis say if you're only in there enjoying Sukkot by yourself and you've not ministered to the needy during that time, you're not fulfilling a mitzvah. You're only filling your stomach. That's it. You might think you're doing a mitzvah, but you're not. You're simply another evil shepherd. And so these 7 shepherds, they're really one identity, David, who united the tribes. If we look at the 8 princes, they're really one identity, the Messiah, the son of David. And the first David, one thing we know about him is he destroyed the Edomites. He and his captain Yoav, they went down and they destroyed all the Edomite men, and none lived except the ones that escaped to Egypt. David was also the one who united the tribes under one monarchy. So if we look at the 7 shepherds, David being that center point, David being basically the 7th shepherd, we would expect Messiah to do what David did, to destroy Edom, except this time to destroy them completely where they couldn't come back. And we know that Amalek came out of Edom, but not just to be the 7th shepherd, but also to be the 8th prince, Messiah, the son of David, who could restore the tribes under one monarchy, where you wouldn't have that division up there in Samaria, established by the house of Joseph. So in Haggai, remember Zerubbabel, again, be designated as a type of Messiah, a type of anointed one to lead the people out of Babylon back to rebuild the temple. And he is associated with Chanukah, the date of Chanukah. It says, then the word of the Lord came a second time to Haggai on the 24th day of the month. This is going to be the month of Kislev, saying, speak to Zerubbabel, governor of Yehuda, saying, I am going to shake the heavens and the earth. I will overthrow the thrones of kingdoms and destroy the power of the kingdoms of the nations. And this is why we have an apocalyptic expectation of the seventh shepherd and the eighth prince at Chanukah. And this is why the Jews were asking Yeshua at the Feast of Dedication in the temple to tell them plainly who he was, because this is their expectation at that time, the 24th day of Kislev. 24th, 25th would be your first day of Chanukah. He says, and I will overthrow the chariots and their riders. There's our chariots again. And the horses and their riders will go down, everyone by the sword of another. On that day, declares the Lord of hosts, I will take you, Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, my servant, declares the Lord, and I will make you like a signet ring, for I have chosen you, declares the Lord of hosts. So right there, this Yehudite governor, his job is to lead the Jews out of Babylon and back to Jerusalem. And we can see, he says, I will make you like a signet ring. There again, forcing us back into the life of Yosef, who drove Pharaoh's second chariot, who typified those roles, again, of royalty, of giver of bread, of shepherd of the sheep. And now he says, I'm going to put this role upon Zerubbabel. But the problem was with that prophecy, the Jews didn't respond to him, not in great numbers. It was a small percentage of Jews who followed Zerubbabel and Yehoshua back to the temple, back to Jerusalem, back to Israel. They didn't respond to that royal signet ring of divine authority because they had prospered economically in Babylon. And they remained in exile basically because of the grain dream, the prosperity dream. And because they stayed too long, remember, dreams can turn into nightmares. All of a sudden, they become subject to the divination. Remember, the second dream was of sun, moon, and stars. And all of a sudden now, wicked Haman, may his name be blotted out, he's doing this act of divination with Purim, with lots, to try to figure out the best time to kill the Jews. So the stars turned against them. They're threatening their lives because they chose prosperity over a return to the promised land. They ignored the royal seal of heaven. And when you reject the royal seal of heaven, then that's when the dream does become a nightmare. And those things start to turn against you. And it's just like they stayed too long in Egypt. The Hebrews stayed too long in Babylon. But had they obeyed, realized there would probably be no Hanukkah celebration, and there'd probably be no Purim, because the kingdoms of those dark nations would have already been overturned according to the prophecy. But they did not heed Zerubbabel. It's not been solved. And so the expectation in the liturgy for Hanukkah is that this prophecy will write again on the 24th of Kislev. And that's why you see the Jews questioning Yeshua at that time. You know, are you going to do this or not? Are you the seventh shepherd and the eighth prince or not? And it says in Haggai 2:18, from this day onward, from the 24th day of the 9th month, from the day when the temple of the Lord was founded, consider, is the seed still in the barn, even including the vine, the fig tree, the pomegranate, the olive tree. It is not borne fruit yet. From this day on, I will bless you. So it is predicting a Sukkot harvest at Hanukkah. And we know that Sukkot is known as the Feast of the Nations. And if we put the prophecies together, we realize that there will be blessing for Israel at Hanukkah, but for the nations, it will be a day of deep gloom and darkness and overthrowing of horses and riders. It won't, it'll be a feast of the nations, but the nations will be feasted upon, basically, by the birds of prey. let's see. I'm not sure I'm doing on time. I probably need to go faster. But at least for us, this explains why Yeshua's long answer had to do with sheep hearing his voice and how you can't hear my voice because you're not one of my sheep. But we realize that Yosef must return to Shechem, to Samaria, to find the lost sheep. He has to find his brothers in exile. And this is what Yeshua says he's going to do, basically. Because remember that the two groups of shepherds, they're broken into Jews and non-Jews. And this is the rabbinical interpretation. And so the Jews are saying, deliver us from the red one now. And Yosef is saying, Yeshua is saying, wait, there's other sheep. There's these non-Jewish sheep. I still have brothers in exile that I must seek out. Okay, we've been over this. And one thing to notice in context, and I think I already said it, is that when we're looking at Ezekiel's prophecy against the evil shepherds, inserted in there is a prophecy against Edom specifically. And you can see how in the Jewish literature, it's tying together this prophecy of the 7 shepherds and 8 princes who will deliver from the Assyrians, along with Ezekiel's prophecy against Edom, how this shepherd, this prince will arise who will be able to defeat Edom. So let's take a look. Let me find where well, that wasn't, I don't even know where it was now. I think I've got to go all the way. So put it on there. Don't look at the screen. It'll make you go cross-eyed. The Brit Chanashah portions I put down are pretty much the same as last week. John 5:1 through 41, and then John chapter 10. And that's what I do. I'm going to go to the woman at the well, because where the well is significant. Here we are. Okay, so therefore, when the Lord knew that the Pharisees had heard that Yeshua was making and baptizing more disciples than John, although Yeshua himself was not baptizing, but his disciples were, he left Judea and went away again into Galilee. And he had to pass through Samaria. Okay, now in your head, just think of where that little red star was on the map. And it's positioning near Shechem, the well of Jacob, and Dotan, where Yosef was sold into slavery. So you've got one compact little area here with lots of history. And remember, Yosef is going to be buried nearby. He's buried at Shechem. The field of Yaakov is near Shechem. So Yeshua is going specifically to this area in Samaria, where the alternate palace stood of the house of Yosef. So he came to a city of Samaria called Sychar, and this is where the well is, near the parcel of ground Yaakov gave to his son Yosef. And Yaakov's well was there. So Yeshua, being wearied from his journey, was sitting thus by the well. It was about the 6th hour. There came a woman of Samaria to draw water. Yeshua said to her, "Give me a drink." For his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. Therefore the Samaritan woman said to him, "How is it that you, being a Jew, ask me for a drink, since I am a Samaritan woman? For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans." Yeshua answered and said to her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is who says to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked him and he would have given you living water." She said to him, "Sir, if you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where then do you get that living water? You are not greater than our father Yaakov, are you, who gave us the well and drank of it himself and his sons and his cattle?" Which is kind of an interesting question. You're not greater than our father Yaakov. And this was the question that came up last night with Yosef's dream, where his father rebukes him for interpreting the dream that Yaakov will bow down to Yosef. It was a disrespect issue. And she says, "You're not greater than our father Yaakov, are you?" Yeshua answered and said to her, "Everyone who drinks of this water will thirst again, but whoever drinks of the water that I will give him shall never thirst. But the water that I will give him will become in him a well of water springing up to eternal life." The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water so that I will not be thirsty, nor have to come all the way here to draw." He said to her, "Go, call your husband and come here." The woman answered and said, "I have no husband." Yeshua said to her, "You have correctly said, 'I have no husband,' for you have had 5 husbands. And the one whom you now have is not your husband. This you have said truly." The woman said to him, "Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. Our fathers worshipped in this mountain, and you people say that in Jerusalem is the place where men ought to worship." Yeshua said to her, "Woman, believe me, an hour is coming when neither in this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But an hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For such people the Father seeks to be his worshipers. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth." The woman said to him, "I know that Messiah is coming, he who is called Christ. When that one comes, he will declare all things to us." Yeshua said to her, "I who speak to you am he." At this point, his disciples came, and they amazed that he had been speaking with a woman, yet no one said, "What do you seek?" or "Why do you speak with her?" Okay, that's interesting. Those two things shoved together. Yeshua says, "I am he," and it's right at that point his disciples return and they can't speak a word. So the woman left her water pot and went into the city and said to the men, "Come see a man who told me all the things that I have done. This is not the Christ, is it?" They went out of the city and were coming to him. Meanwhile, the disciples were urging him, saying, "Rabbi, eat." But he said, "I have food to eat that you do not know about." So the disciples were saying to one another, "No one brought him anything to eat, did he?" He said to them, "My food is to do the will of him who sent me and to accomplish his work. Do you not say that there are yet 4 months, and then comes the harvest? Behold, I say to you, lift up your eyes and look on the fields, that they are white for harvest. Already he who reaps is receiving wages and is gathering fruit for life eternal, so that he who sows and he who reaps may rejoice together. For in this case, the saying is true. Once I sent you to reap that for which you had not labored. Others labored, and you have entered into their labor." The Samaritans from that city, many of the Samaritans believed in him because of the word of the woman who testified, "He told me all the things that I have done." So when the Samaritans came to Yeshua, they were asking him to stay with them, and he stayed there 2 days. Many more believed because of his word, and they were saying to the woman, "It is no longer because of what you said that we believe, for we have heard for ourselves and know that this one is indeed the Savior of the world." And the reason I put in bold there, he stayed there 2 days. Sometimes a day is symbolic of a longer period of time or an epoch of time. And if a day with the Lord is 1,000 years, we might substitute in there, he stayed there 2,000 years among the Samaritans. Not literally, but in terms of prophetically, I believe there might be something there. And so we can match this again with John 10:22, when he's in the temple at Hanukkah. Again, the question is, who are you? How long are you going to keep us in suspense? If you are the Mashiach, tell us plainly. And Yeshua said, I told you and you do not believe. Well, this is exactly the conversation we're getting back here with the Samaritans. They say no longer that we believe. We have heard for ourselves. Okay, they heard something in that city that this particular is not. Yeshua says, I already told you plainly, but you don't believe me. Why? Because you're not of my sheep. My sheep hear my voice. I know them. They follow me. I give eternal life to them. They will never perish. No one will snatch them out of my hand. My Father who has given them to me is greater than all. And again, we're getting back to the my Father language of Elisha, of the king of Israel. I don't think these are random intersections. He says, I and the Father are one. At this point, we know Yeshua has sent the 12 to buy food. What does that remind you of? Well, we've got brothers being sent to buy food. And they are in a kind of a hostile, they're being sent into a hostile situation. The Egyptians aren't the greatest of friends. They're not necessarily enemies, but they're not the greatest of friends. Yeshua sits and he asks water of a woman who the Jews consider loathsome. And all of a sudden he starts talking about living water. Well, Elisha at Jericho takes a flask of salt, pours it into the well, and he sweetens the water so that it can once again be inhabited, the place where they had crossed the Yarden as a nation. And then remember, there were poisonous gourds that were cooked in the soup. And what does Elisha do? He says, throw flour into it. And all of a sudden, it's not poison anymore. So he uses flour with the food, and he uses salt in the water. And incidentally, you would use flour for a mincha. That could be presented with your mincha. Flour could, especially for a poor person, the poorer you were, the more likely you were to bring flour as an offering. We've got Egyptians who won't eat with a Hebrew because their profession is loathsome. They are shepherds. And so Yeshua is sitting here having a drink of water with a woman considered loathsome, that no Jew would ever sit with. Yeshua starts speaking of the gift of God, and the word for gift in Hebrew is mincha, which goes back to that sacrifice. He says, if you knew the gift of God, again, giving us a GPS back to the mincha that was sent to Yosef, the mincha that was sent to Esav. It's putting us back into our Yosef narrative. The woman starts speaking of Mashiach. If we go back into Elisha's life, we have another miracle of oil that's tied specifically to Elisha, but in tradition, it's also tied to Hanukkah, that there's only one flask of oil that could be found in the house, that could be found. And somehow the tradition is that that one flask of oil didn't burn out. It just kept going for the whole 8 days. And, you know, it's kind of a Hebrew roots custom for there to be at least one voice to speak up and say that didn't really happen. There's no record of this until such and such date. You know, and my answer would be, well, how do you know it didn't happen if you weren't there? Just because something doesn't appear in a written record until a certain date in history does not mean it didn't happen. If we go by date, then the story of the flood written down by Gilgamesh predates the writing of the flood of Noah, therefore we should believe Gilgamesh and not God. Sometimes our arguments are pretty flimsy. At any rate, it's the miracle of the oil is not the most important thing to know about Hanukkah. But as we're looking at this context of the 7 shepherds, the 8 princes, and so forth, the house of Joseph, Elisha, these miracles that take place in Samaria, around Dothan, Samaria, Shechem. Now we have a widow woman who is thought to be Obadiah's widow. Remember, Obadiah had given shelter when the prophets of God were being hunted under Ahab and Jezebel, and he hid them and fed them at his own expense until he was destitute. And then he borrowed money to continue sustaining them, and he died. And so his widow was left with the debt. And the king, he'd actually bought from the king, and he was going to come recover the debt because she didn't have the money. She was going to have to give over her sons as slaves. And so she goes to Elisha and says, look, my husband did the greatest of deeds. He protected the prophets from destruction, fed them at his own expense, went into poverty, and now I'm about to lose my sons. He says, well, what do you have? And she has 1 flask of oil. He says, okay, borrow as many earthenware pots as you can from your neighbors and start pouring. And the miracle of the oil is it didn't stop until every single earthenware vessel was full of oil. And that's how they were out of debt and sustained themselves through the famine. And the woman brings up this Mashiach. This Mashiach that is going to have house of Yosef-like characteristics, that has significant events occurring in this very area where the miracle of the oil would have occurred. It's almost like a Hanukkah for the northern tribes, like a Hanukkah for the house of Joseph or Ephraim. Yosef revealed his secret identity to his brothers. He says, I am Yosef. And that's exactly what Yeshua does. He reveals himself to the Samaritan woman. He says, I am he. I'm the Mashiach. I'm the one. I'm the 7th shepherd. I'm the 8th prince. I'm the one. And so his disciples come back, and it says they were amazed that he'd been speaking with a woman. Yet no one said, what do you seek? Or why do you speak with her? In other words, they too, like Joseph's brothers, they're speechless. They don't know what to say. They're seeing it, but they're not believing it. Again, this goes back to Yeshua sitting with the Samaritan woman, having a drink of water when, again, like the Egyptians, they would not eat together at the same table. And this is what amazes the disciples when they come back, and Yeshua is sitting there having a drink of water with a Samaritan woman. And in fact, in Egypt, they deified sheep, and they didn't eat a lot of sheep. I read a journal article where they analyzed these mummies from this particular period, and they said pretty much through most periods up until the Greek occupation, Egyptians were primarily vegetarian. They didn't even eat a lot of fish, and you would think they would eat a lot of fish out of the Nile. They didn't. They were primarily wheat, barley, and vegetable eaters. That was the main source of their diet. They just weren't into eating sheep that much. Again, they were more representative of deity. They would have used the wool, but in terms of shepherding, that just wasn't their thing. Let's see. So we have, going back to Zerubbabel and Yehoshua, now that we've kind of looked at some parallels, and my challenge to you this week is take that passage of the conversation between Yeshua and the Samaritan woman where he's revealing himself as Messiah. I pulled out some parallels there. See if you can find more. There's got to be more in there. And you might have to, slip into different Torah portions, not just Vayigash, but you might find more in there, more cross-references that would give us more insight as to what exactly Yeshua was accomplishing there at Jacob's well. Again, going back to the tribal territory of Yosef. So we have Zerubbabel and Yehoshua who are gathering some to go back to the temple, back to Jerusalem, but more stayed behind. And that's what got them into such jeopardy, where we've got the book of Esther, the time of Purim, because had they gone back with Zerubbabel, there wouldn't have been anybody there among the 127 provinces to try to kill. But Zerubbabel kind of came to be known as the Mashiach that the Jews didn't want. At least the Babylonian Jews, they didn't want him. They preferred their economic security to a Mashiach. And I'm not sure that that's changed much. If we read the book of Revelation, it's the same story. People prefer their economic security to the Mashiach, and they will prefer it right up until the point they see that economic security burning, going up literally in smoke, and they're mourning it. And what is significant about that is they're not mourning Mashiach. Remember, it says they will look on him whom they have pierced. They will mourn for him as one mourns for an only son. You don't see them mourn for that lost opportunity to serve Mashiach. You see them mourning what they lost in terms of money, goods, services, dominating others. And so Zerubbabel became kind of with a small who wanted the people to go back to a land they didn't want. And so like Egypt, Babylon became a trap. The economic prosperity was the bait in the trap. And then once they were in it, then that's when we see Haman doing the thing with the Purim. Then the stars are going to enslave them and eventually try to take their lives. So we can see that regardless of those who stayed in Babylon, there was a remnant who did go back with Zerubbabel and Yehoshua, Ezra and Nehemiah, and they began rebuilding the temple. They built the second Beit Hamikdash, and it's going to be consecrated on the 25th of Kislev. And they're going to complete what was begun on the 24th of Kislev many years earlier. When we look at Hanukkah, the victory of the Maccabees, we have to realize that that went wrong too. All right, even though they had, staggered into the house, put their hand on the wall, the snake had bit them. The Greeks moved in. And they say, okay, we've overcome the Greeks. But remember, there's two kinds of enemies. There's the enemy outside, and then there's the evil shepherd inside. And the Maccabees, who had been such heroes of remember, they are from a priestly class. It's their job to serve in the temple. After the division and the assigning of the role to Levi and the sons of Aaron as the Kohanim, then it is not for men from another tribe to perform the role of the Kohanim or to perform the role of the Levites. Once the Maccabees had power, what they actually did is they took possession of the throne, something they should have never done. It would be like, you remember when we had a king who decided he wanted to offer sacrifices in place of the priests, and then he was stricken? with leprosy? Okay, it's kind of the reverse. You've got the priestly Maccabees who now say, you know what, we want to be kings. Even though it requires someone from the tribe of Judah, from the line of David, to rule upon the throne of Israel, they took that authority upon themselves. This starts a new era of separating brothers. And eventually, because of that animosity over this usurpation of the throne, this is one of the primary reasons that the Essenes go down into the desert. They're like, no, this is wrong. It takes a priest to be a priest, and it takes a king to be a king. The Maccabees can't continue buying these offices. This is defiled, this is wrong, this is corrupt, this is not what it should be. What started out as a dream is turned into a nightmare. And eventually this animosity among brothers leads to another exile when the Romans eventually, for the last time, kick them out. And that's what Yeshua predicts. They're in Samaria. He says there's a time coming when it doesn't matter whether you worship in Mount Gerizim or you worship in Jerusalem. If they reject the Messiah, they're not even going to be able to worship in either place. If they don't recognize the work of the seventh shepherd and the eighth prince. If they don't get on board with gathering the sheep, basically. And that's what we know about the second temple in the rabbinic literature. It just keeps coming up that the second temple was destroyed because of baseless hatred among brothers. And that's the seventh abomination of the wicked lamp, the separation of brothers. And it's not that the Samaritans were innocent. It's not just a Jew thing. The reason the disciples were so aghast that Yeshua would sit and talk to a Samaritan is you have to remember 150 years before the Hanukkah that we know about today was the first Hanukkah. The first Hanukkah was not the one of the Maccabees. It was 150 years earlier when the Samaritans convinced Alexander the Great and his army to march on Jerusalem to destroy it. They sold out their brothers. And Shimon HaTzadik puts on his priestly garments, the nobles put on their noble robes, and they march all night. The torches don't go out. They march to meet Alexander the Great. And Alexander the Great gets off his horse. He bows before the high priest because he has seen him in a dream. And basically Alexander says, what can we do for you today? And the high priest says, basically, why are you marching against us? We make sacrifices on behalf of the nation. Why would you want to destroy that which intercedes for you? And Alexander knows this is true because he's had a dream of Shimon HaTzadik. He's seen the high priest in his dreams. So basically, what the Samaritans had incited Alexander to do to the Jews and to Jerusalem, done to them. So not every Samaritan was good. They had evil intentions. What they wanted to do was to replace Jerusalem and make Mount Gerizim the sole place of worship, kind of revisiting the sins of the house of Joseph under the northern monarchy. And that's what she mentions it to Yeshua. Our fathers worshipped in this mountain. And you people say that in Jerusalem is the place where men ought to worship. But again, those prophecies of Ezekiel, if you take time to read through them, especially starting around chapter 34, you'll read about the shepherd kings and the evil that they've done. And that was one reason that Joseph's brothers hated him. He reported on their abuse of the sheep while they were shepherding. Even Shimon and Levi weren't nice. Their father says they hamstrung oxen when they got angry. And this is not the behavior of kings. This is not the behavior of priests. This is not the behavior of shepherds of the sheep of Israel. And so Yeshua says, the fields are white unto harvest. The Samaritans are going to identify with Joseph. They live in his tribal territory. They know that their ancestor Yosef has a dream of grain, of sheaves being gathered. In other words, there's been a full harvest. Sheaves are being gathered. And Yeshua points out, and his disciples need to hear it, that, hey, what Yosef saw, you can harvest it now. Yosef sowed these seeds a long time ago, and it's been growing for a long time. But now is the time to go out and harvest. Yes, you're benefiting from seeds that others have sown. That's fine. We're all working together as brothers. And he decides to point this out to his disciples in Samaria, in the prime location, that little triangle there of the house of Yosef, the house of Ephraim, the northern tribes. Well, my alarm didn't go. I just kept talking and talking. And I thought, well, isn't the alarm ever going to go off? Good grief.